Join me, world religion scholar and spiritual adventurer Jeremy Nicol, as I travel on a pilgrimage through some of India's most sacred sites. Through my eyes, you will meet the Buddha as you have never seen him before. Join a ritual on the Holy Mother Ganges. Experience Diwali with the royal family of Jaipur, and learn how to drive a tuk-tuk without hitting a sacred cow. Whatever you believe or don't believe, I invite you into this journey with the hope that you might find your own meaning in what you see. Away we go. My next stop was Buddha's birthplace, a small town just over the border with Nepal called Lumbini. It's less than 200 miles away, comparable to a drive from Boston to New York City, which I've done many times in 3 hours. But the roads here are nothing like what I'm used to back home. In India, highways are either non-existent or in such disrepair that it's actually quicker, if you can call it that, to take city streets, even at this great a distance. So instead of 3 hours, the trip took 10, which made for an endlessly long journey that concluded with the local kamikaze driving style and industrial smog teaming up to make for the most terrifying driving conditions I have ever witnessed. And then, suddenly, I found myself on a tranquil little back street in Lumbini, Nepal. The quiet little road that leads to the birthplace of Siddhartha Gautama, who would become Buddha. And this quiet little road was my first clue that something was off in the way I understood the story of the Buddha, which was that he was royalty, a prince born to a king and queen in a palace. And I had always previously mapped a Western understanding of those words, royalty and palace, onto his story. He may indeed have been a prince, but his home life and upbringing was clearly much more a Bethlehem backwater experience than I had been led to believe, which is definitely the vibe of the place. Even the stone that marks his birth spot felt very understated. While many of the Buddhist pilgrimage sites are adorned with incredible temples, the two most striking features here are the pole that Ashoka, the main Buddhist patron of India, had installed here roughly 2 centuries after his death, and the giant Bodhi tree. The tree still attracts pilgrims from around the world to meditate, chant, and pray here, and it was nice to see a fair amount of kids visiting the site. But like many stories, Gautama's gets a lot more interesting once the hero leaves his little hometown. One day, on a trip outside of the palace on his horse, Gautama sees in short succession an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wise man, and it causes him to feel overwhelmed by the suffering of the world. This leads to him sneaking out in the middle of the night, abandoning his family, and rejecting his wealth and status. At this point, the popular version of the story usually flashes forward to Gautama, now the Buddha, meditating under the Bodhi tree in India and becoming enlightened. But a very important part, in my opinion perhaps the most important part of the entire story, happens during what we skip when we fast forward. So let's flip back from the Bodhi tree for a minute, to a time we don't talk about much in the mainstream Buddha story, but is very important to his life. After leaving everything behind, it didn't just all fall together for Gautama. In fact, he spent years wandering in this rugged terrain in what is now India, mostly alone, trying to find a new way of understanding the world that could help free it from suffering. Through different combinations of spiritual practices, from extreme fasts to postures and movement exercises, he combined different forms of mental focus in revolving locations. And he failed over and over and over again to discover anything beyond what he already knew. It must have been a frustrating time for him. I visited this cave, part of a series known as Dung Shawari, about an hour outside of Bodh Gaya, where Gautama spent 6 years alone meditating in the dark. I sat in that same darkness and tried to feel whatever of his presence could remain. At first, it was just kind of lonely. But then the coziness of the space became apparent and I felt protected, wrapped up. I ended up having a short but meaningful sit in that cave and left more in touch with Gautama's resoluteness. But coming out into the light and walking back down the hill, I could sense immediately why it never worked here for Gautama, in the ultimate sense. It's too removed, too isolated from the world. But he knew he was onto something, and he believed in himself and his vision, and he did not give up. When all the possibilities of this cave were exhausted, he moved on, out of the darkness, and down the hill, a few dozen dusty miles to a much different spot, amidst the world and under the protective shade of a fig tree. I made the trip from the cave to the fig tree in a short drive, and was absolutely blown away by what I found at the Mahabodhi temple complex in Bodh Gaya. It was the first Buddhist site I've been to that looks and feels like I expected. And it didn't hurt that I first arrived at sunset, just in time to help parade one of the holy elements around the temple and under a third-generation cutting of the original Bodhi tree. After years of failure, this is where it all finally came together for Gautama. Just 3 days and 3 nights of meditation here, and he found that consciousness-shifting experience he had been seeking. But the story hardly ends there. Over the next 7 weeks, Buddha remained at this site, continuing to innovate and create new forms of meditation, as well as reflecting deeply on his experience and figuring out how to share it with others, which is where we'll next pick up this story. There are no more deer at Deer Park, the forbidden forest in Sarnath, India, that Buddha traveled to after leaving Bodh Gaya. He traveled here because he realized that some of the men he had studied with on his path to enlightenment would understand his new teaching the easiest, and this was where he would find them. He was correct. They took to it immediately and became his first disciples, and themselves attained enlightenment as they received his teachings here on this spot. I too had a very powerful experience here at Deer Park, a long meditation next to my father, who originally introduced me to Buddhism as a child and joined me for this part of the trip. The last stop on my pilgrimage of Buddhist sites was of a more somber note, as I traveled north, alone again, to Kushinagar, India. On this spot, on his way home to Lumbini, Buddha realized his end was fast approaching. I arrived to the site at sunrise, just in time to participate in a ritual recreating the deathbed Buddha instructed his friends to prepare for him 2,500 years ago. We paraded the holy elements around the stupa built on the very spot that Buddha died, and then I watched and chanted with the other pilgrims as the elements were arranged by monks into the correct final layout. I then moved into a temple erected just next to the stupa. Inside the temple is this incredible 5th century statue of the reclining Buddha preparing to die. I was also able to participate in a ritual where his statue is prepared for cremation as Buddha's body would have been. It has also become tradition for Buddhist pilgrims from some Asian countries to rub gold leafing on statues of the Buddha in search of positive karma. And as you can see, this one is now covered in it. It seems to me an ironic tribute to a man whose truth was found by letting go of attachment to such material things as gold, but such is religion. And while this is the site of Buddha's death, it is hardly a sad place or a depressing visit. After all, this is what it was all about for Buddha. He died and attained full nirvana, no longer burdened by his flesh. I, on the other hand, remain fully burdened by mine, but nonetheless deeply changed by my experience walking with Gautama through his life, enlightenment, teaching, and death, and hope you are too.